The most underrepresented cohort of witnesses that day were the civilian employees of both City Hall and the Dallas Police Department. While it is true that none were present to directly witness Jack Ruby shooting Oswald, their testimonies regarding the preparations for the transfer and the aftermath provide important pieces to the overall picture of the puzzle, as it were. However, other than in records of the DPD investigation and the Warren Commission, there is little to no reference to be found regarding these people and their stories, until now. The non-police and media personnel that were at or outside City Hall that morning, and who provided at least one statement to the subsequent investigations were Fred Bieberdorf, first aid attendant, Francis Kaysen, dispatcher, Napoleon Daniels, former police officer, Nolan Dement, bystander, Doyle Lane, Western Union supervisor, Harold Fuqua, parking attendant, Wilfred Ray Jones, bystander, Edward Kelly, maintenance, Louis McKenzie, porter, Johnny F. Newton, jail clerk, Edward Pierce, engineer, Alfreadia Riggs, porter, John Servants, head porter, and Jerry D. Slocum, jail clerk. Any reasons behind the seemingly random nature of who was and was not interviewed by which investigation remains anybody's guess, particularly when it came to who the DPD did not interview. Consider, for instance, how crucial the testimony of Dallas local Fred Bieberdorf, who provided Oswald with first aid after he had been shot, ought to have been but was not taken. That aside, we will first focus on a group of workers who were employed to ensure the smooth running of all infrastructure across both buildings of the City Hall complex, including the basement car park. They were Harold Hal Fuqua, Edward Kelly, Louis McKenzie, Edward Pierce, Alfreadia Riggs, and John Servants. For the porter and parking workers, their base of work was clearly the car park in the City Hall basement. Their jobs were focused on keeping the area in order, getting police personnel cars parked or ready for use, and keeping the general public from parking down there. For the maintenance and engineer workers, their work would take them to all parts of both buildings, including the utility spaces across the sub-basement level. There was also a female standing with the workers who was identified as a telephone operator by the name of Ruth, who was most likely Ruth Darnell. But it is not evident what her movements were after that point. Once the search of the basement began, the City Hall workers remained in the far eastern end of the basement, where the stairs and elevators went up to the annex building, having already stopped work to watch the comings and goings in preparation for the transfer. To this point, Harold Fuqua even testified to the FBI of observing car trunks being opened and searched. Edward Pierce also thought they could stay and watch the proceedings that morning, up to and including Oswald's transfer, if they kept out of the way. But they were ordered to clear out of the basement, and not just for the time it took police personnel to search it. In his own testimony to the DPD, it was Reserve Officer Brock who gave these orders, and presumably this was done a few minutes after he arrived in the basement for assignment at around 9:30 a.m. Porter Louis McKenzie, who was responsible that day for running the service elevator, took the group up that way to the first floor. Soon Brock called for McKenzie to bring the service elevator back down so he, McKenzie, could escort, according to Brock's own testimony to the Warren Commission, one of the TV men over there who wanted to go up the fifth floor to do some kind of work with the equipment there. McKenzie would corroborate that the repairman only spent a few minutes doing whatever it was he was doing up in the upper floors of the annex building before he brought him back down. After that, Brock told McKenzie to leave the service elevator locked on the first floor and not bring it back down to the basement. McKenzie did so by locking it in place with a key. McKenzie actually confirmed that there were passageways that connected the two buildings on the first, second, and third floors, and they would be locked with a metal accordion-style expanding gate. Overnights and on the weekends, the gates were routinely locked, so it is easy to imagine that they were in all probability locked on that day too. And Edward Pierce said that he noticed the first floor passage gate was locked that morning. The workers, not wanting to miss any of the happenings surrounding Oswald's transfer, stayed on the first floor and walked to the Commerce Street entrance. This is where Louis McKenzie would rejoin them. In fact, the group can be seen briefly in footage taken out on the street by passerby George Taplin. It appears that the group stayed together in this location for up to 1 hour. At which point, Harold Fuqua and Alfreadia Riggs decided to leave to find a television to watch the coverage of the transfer instead. Having both been long-serving employees of City Hall, Fuqua, 6 years, Riggs, 7 years, they would have known that the nearest television was down in the locker room in the sub-basement level of the City Hall building. However, given they had been ordered out of the basement as a security measure, and Oswald had still not been transferred, it is understandable that they chose to avoid taking a direct route to the locker room as it would have likely resulted in them being turned away, or worse, in trouble. Instead, they retraced the way they had come with the other workers along the first floor of the annex building to where the elevators and stairwell were. As McKinsey had left the service elevator locked on the first floor, it was in position for them to walk through and exit through the rear door and out to the fire escape and a passage that led directly to the outer door. According to both Riggs and Fuqua, in their testimonies to the Warren Commission, it was Riggs who used the keys that were always left hung up in the elevator to unlock the outer door. He kept them with him, but said that he made sure the alleyway door was locked on the outside by shaking on the door handle. This is an important point that we will revisit later. Riggs and Fuqua walked through an alleyway to Main Street and began to walk west, along the front of the annex building. They then came to the top of the ramp that led from the street down to the basement. This is where Officer Roy Vaughn had been standing guard for at least the last hour, and it was this point where Jack Ruby was most commonly purported as entering the basement in time to shoot Oswald. We will also revisit this location and the comings and goings of people there in more detail. However, Vaughn did confirm in his testimony that some City Hall janitorial staff approached on foot from the east, which is the direction Riggs and Fuqua would have come from. And they said they stopped at the top of the ramp for only a few moments to look down into the basement before walking on. Vaughn also corroborated this. Riggs and Fuqua rounded the corner of Main and Harwood Streets and stopped below the steps up to City Hall. According to Riggs, Fuqua asked him to go down the steps and check to see if it would be all right for us to go down because they, were under the impression they had a police officer on the door. Riggs did so and discovered that there weren't any officers guarding the basement entrance from there into City Hall, so he turned around and told Fuqua to come down. This further reiterates the fact that all public entrances into City Hall that morning were not guarded and therefore secure. Riggs and Fuqua walked down the hallway and got as far as the door before the jail office. There they got close enough to see all of the media assembled. They turned right and headed down the corridor that led to the records room, assembly room, and the stairs down to the locker room. Once down there, they encountered someone who was all alone. Let's pick it up with Riggs' recollection to the Warren Commission's counsel, Leon Hubert, with what happened next. Hubert, you mean you went down into the locker room? That is where all the policemen have their lockers, and there's a recreation room and television. And Riggs, yes, sir. And television, and there was a jail attendant down there. Actually, he didn't work in the jail office. He's not a policeman, but he works in the jail office. Hubert, what is his name? Do you know? Riggs, no, sir, I really don't. He told us that he didn't think they were going to show it on television. He imagined they were going to run a tape and show it later on. Said, well, we should have stayed up there. Maybe we could have seen him when they brought him out. Yet Counsel Hubert, who interviewed both men, did not pursue the question of the unidentified man in the locker room with Fuqua. But thankfully, Fuqua corroborated the encounter with the man, and that he said he thought the transfer would be shown as reruns only. Yet Hubert did not ask Fuqua if he could identify him. Who was the man Riggs and Fuqua encountered in the locker room? Per Riggs' speculation, it well could have been any kind of a police officer that he saw or associated with the jail office. And this could feasibly have been any officer from reserve to patrol officer to detective, as all had reason to be there during normal times of operation. I contend that it was Detective Charles Blackie Harrison, as he was the only person that testified to being in the sub-basement locker room at any point that morning, and his reason was to simply buy some cigars from the vending machine down there. And there is evidence that he may have been down there for more than just a quick trip, as other detectives in his unit testified that they asked him where he had been when he reappeared in the basement to join them for Oswald's transfer. So if the man was Blackie Harrison, why would he have urged Riggs and Fuqua to go somewhere else to observe Oswald's transfer? The locker room was large enough for them all to sit and watch whatever coverage was broadcast. So what was the big deal with redirecting Riggs and Fuqua away? There were payphones in the locker room as well. Was it part of his business that morning to make or take phone calls on them? And that he didn't want anyone else overhearing him? In any event, Alfreadia Riggs bought a can of chili from a vending machine, and he ate from it as he and Fuqua left there to go back upstairs. According to both men, they stood in the Harwood Street hallway and were there when Oswald was shot. They both would testify to not seeing it take place, just to hearing and seeing the chaos that broke out. Dallas attorney Tom Howard's law firm was situated in one of the buildings across Harwood Street from City Hall. On the morning of Oswald's transfer, as he would have done, no doubt many times before, he walked over to the city jail. On this occasion, he would tell the FBI he did so because he had received a call from someone in the jail office on behalf of someone else, presumably an inmate. He was able to enter down into the basement level of City Hall from Harwood Street, down the same steps that Harold Fuqua and Alfreadia Riggs had. He did so with the intention of taking the elevator up to the 5th floor from the jail office. The obvious inference being that the main entrance from Harwood Street would have been locked. Having walked down to the jail office, Howard testified that he did get to the elevator there and punched the button to go to the 5th floor. He said that he then turned to someone he presumed was a detective and asked if they were fixing to take him, Oswald, out of here. Oddly, Howard couldn't recall if the detective said anything in response. In any event, Howard did not go up in the elevator. Instead, he found his way back out into the hallway. Soon he would notice a sudden jostling and shoving among the newsmen, and then he heard a shot. He did not see Lee Oswald or Jack Ruby or any of the shooting. Instead, according to his own words, he turned around and simply walked back along the corridor he had entered from, then out onto Harwood Street and stood on the sidewalk. There he would confer with his legal partner, Coley Sullivan, before returning over the road to their offices. Using the testimony of others, we can apply some firm question marks to Howard's one and only account of his movements in the City Hall basement in the moments prior to Oswald emerging and being shot. Detective Homer McGee told both the DPD and FBI investigations that he was standing inside the jail office. There was an information desk and window, which was opposite the elevator that faced out into the hallway. He noticed Tom Howard walk up to the window out in the hallway from Harwood Street. According to McGee, Oswald then emerged from the elevator to be let out for the transfer. As that was happening, McGee said that Howard waved through the window, said that he'd seen all he'd needed to see, and walked back up the hallway. Moments later, Oswald was shot. Detective H. Baron Reynolds was the only other person to positively identify Tom Howard in the lobby outside of the jail office in the moments just prior to the shooting. Tom Howard is just another case that exemplifies how easy the basement in City Hall was to access, right up to when Oswald was shot. However, what is even more strange about the case of Howard is the fact that, in barely a matter of hours, he would be acting as Jack Ruby's lawyer. So if Howard was lying about his movements in the crucial moments prior to the shooting, the question must be asked why. His stake in the events of the day would apparently only come into play after Ruby had shot Oswald. But the coincidence of him being there at that point in time and his saying that he had seen everything he had needed to see before exiting certainly is curious.